to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. Today we're here with Joseph Ho talking about his new book, Developing Mission. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
So, what is, by way of introduction, Developing Mission about?
All right. Well, my book is about photography and filmmaking by American Protestant and Catholic missionaries in modern China from the 1920s through the early 1950s. And in it, I look at how image making and images by missionaries embedded in locations across China represented transnational Sino-US experiences, local and national change in times of peace and war, and the roles of visual technologies in shaping history.
Nice pithy summary there. Which sort of leads, though, into an interesting question about something that you raise in your introduction, which is that missionary photography and filmmaking is really somewhat neglected in studies of missionary activity in China at this time. Why has that been the case?
So I think there are three responses to this. First, there is the broader issue of missionaries and Chinese Christian communities being seen as secondary players or minor figures in modern Chinese history. Missionaries are often portrayed in one-dimensional terms, either as heroes or saints from certain perspectives, or villains or imperialists from a political one. So the figure of the missionary itself can be polarizing or otherwise neglected. Now, secondly, most historians work in the realm of text rather than visual analysis, without necessarily having a deep understanding of photographic or film technology, or the ways in which visual material is deployed. So images are often used as illustrations without necessarily questioning the subject, makers, audiences, and processes involved in making or circulating them. Finally, once you get into the archival realm, you realize there are literally hundreds of thousands, if not more, images floating around in institutional archives, in family collections, churches, religious orders, and other places, all of which come from missions in China. So it's difficult to know where to start unless you can tie all of these materials and frameworks together. So that's the challenge as well as the excitement.
Because in the end, in your book, you mostly focus on a few particular missionary families, and even then, that's a lot of material over the course of, decades of activity. And what that leads into is, well, there's all this material, but what does it mean as such? What does it tell us that you can't just get from text?
That's a great question. Many things. I'd like to think about how we might approach the making of an image of something or someone, as opposed to simply writing about it. Now, in making an image, there's the deployment of a visual device and all of the mental and physical performances needed to use it. Image making is connected closely to the kinds of cameras and visual processes involved. Just like taking a snapshot with an iPhone is very different from pointing a big camera at someone. And I argue that compact cameras that many of the missionaries used are the iPhones of their time in some ways. The image maker needs to think in terms of how to operate a camera while engaging in some kind of interaction with the scene in front of the lens. It's a different kind of reality compared to sitting down and writing about something after the fact. Furthermore, once the image is made and begins to circulate, we can trace, or at least try to trace, where it goes, what kinds of networks and communities it passes through, and where it ultimately ends up. And in terms of documentation, images capture details that may escape textual description. Anything from the angle of the sunlight, people's expressions and fashions, movement and narrative form if you're looking at a film, or how things are arranged in space and place. These are just the basics. All of this is wrapped up in missionaries and their visual practices being mediators. They move between worlds, times, and ways of seeing and imagining.
Yeah, and to dwell on that for a little while, what's kind of distinctive about images is that, in a way, what you're imaging has to cooperate with you, in a way. They don't have to know that you're there, but they do have to be in frame. Whereas you can just write about anything, anytime, anywhere, especially where we're talking stage photographs and specifically, filmed instances. One description I quite liked from the book was where a doctor walks out and points at the sign declaring what the name of the hospital is. There's such a close interactivity between author, if you will, and subject in a way that, in a sense, doesn't really exist for a lot of textual mediums.
That's right.
And yet, of course, I mean, these textual mediums still do exist in the case of these photographs. As you know, there are records of where these move and how they're made, which kind of leans into a broader philosophical point almost in a way, which is like, are photographs doomed to be auxiliary to textual materials? Can you have a history written purely on the basis of photographs and films that just ignores any text whatsoever?
Again, an excellent question, and perhaps you might guess my response, but I would say it's somewhere in between, that images and text speak to each other. I like to think of text as framing images, but it's just one of many frames that may include memory, that it may include images that speak to each other, and certainly in terms of experience, an image maker or recipient, whether these are American missionaries or Chinese individuals, if they're writing about an image, might include some description about this context, but the researcher might see other details or know about larger historical themes that go beyond just that one caption, whether short or long. In other contexts, text might flesh out motivations and attention to certain elements or contexts of the image that escape us, but may be known to the original makers and audiences. And in terms of standing on their own, once you see images as part of a process, that they're connected to technology, they're connected to imagination, they move through space and time and across geographical place, then it becomes much more than an illustration. There are all of these other nuances involved. And that's why I feel like they certainly speak to each other, text and image.
And the matter of interpretation is one that does come across quite a few times in your book. I mean, there's to an extent parts where you talk about tensions between missionaries in China and in America, both Catholic and Protestant, over how much missionarying are they doing versus just general, arguably secular medical support, which also, of course, applied to photographs and films, where obviously the equipment for producing them was provided a lot of the time by donations from congregations who kind of expected things to be sent back. So how did interpretation of these images differ between kind of the missionaries themselves taking them, other audiences in China who might have encountered them, and in turn finally kind of the US where they were ultimately intended to end up in some sense?
Right. So sometimes the connection is very direct in that, as you say, churches in the United States are raising funds to buy a movie camera to send to China for this medical missionary family. And then the medical missionary family comes back on furlough and then screens the films for these American audiences. But sometimes there are real divergences. Two good examples are found in photographs sent by an American Catholic order, the Passionists, from West Hunan in the mid-1920s to their order's headquarters in West Hoboken, New Jersey. Now, some of these images were meant to document famine responses, but when they're received, the order's editors of a religious magazine essentially photoshopped the images to make the people in them look more starved. So in one case, they actually airbrush out a tree growing in the background of a photo, which contains a kind of a priest standing next to an emaciated Chinese father and son, and they take this out possibly because the tree is full of fruit. So when the Passionist missionaries in China get word about this, they're extremely upset that the images have been manipulated and exaggerated. And they say, even going as far to kind of imply that this is deceitful, even sinful activity to manipulate an image to raise a response back at home. And in another case, there's a photograph of a boat that's sinking on the Yuan River in West Hunan. And it basically gets captioned when it arrives in New Jersey as, "Here's a boat on a river." And the missionaries find out about this and they write angry letters back reprimanding the editor about the caption, saying that it has, quote unquote, emasculated the image, because the image is really about the dangers of river travel and how lives and supplies are often lost in boat wrecks and all sorts of other contexts that only someone making the image in that environment would know. So there are certainly divergences there.
Yeah, thanks. And what's really quite interesting about the boat thing, and to be fair, this is going to be a bit of a digression, is that one a particularly prominent part of your book is the supply chain, in effect, in photography. That this isn't a period in which cameras have their own internal developing stuff, or digital cameras that can just instantly send an image off into the cloud. These are cameras that produce negatives that need to be processed and printed out. at specialized workshops. So a lot of these missionaries who are often in rural environments are forwarding their negatives off to be processed in urban centers and then sent off in multiple directions. Could you talk a little bit about how that affects photography as a as a medium in this time? And I guess what do you think probably the most interesting stories that deal with this supply chain issue?
Sure. So, in one sense, we are comparing photography and filmmaking of this time period to, of course, earlier forms of image making, where photographers literally have to travel these massive dark rooms in wagons and with an army of servants carrying water to develop the images. And in the time period of the 20s, 30s, and 40s, the missionaries no longer have to do that. They have, of course, more compact cameras. Some of them do send their images out for processing, and others build home darkrooms. And like many amateur photographers the world around, process their own images in the comfort of their home. So in a way, there's a kind of evolution of technology that shortens the supply chain or facilitates image making. But in one case, one particular family that I write about in the fourth chapter of this book, they have a movie camera that takes color film, and they have to send this color film out. The problem is they're stuck in wartime China, and they've made an image of their family on Kodachrome. And the only place in the world that can process Kodachrome is Eastman Kodak in Rochester, New York. So they literally have to have the film smuggled out through enemy lines. It gets on an airplane in West China, goes flying over the Himalayas, ends up on a boat that crosses the Atlantic, and finally arrives in Rochester, New York, where it's processed and sits there because there's no forwarding address. And then by some coincidence, the family ends up first in a Japanese internment camp and then repatriated back to the United States in 1943. And the father, who is a medical missionary, ends up getting a job as the company physician at Eastman Kodak, where he is accidentally reunited with his film that has preceded him in traveling across the wartime world by thousands of miles and at least 2 years. So that's a kind of a fun story about the supply chain and how these experiences are wrapped up with that.
Yeah, and I think what was so striking when reading the book is just the extent of the human stories that are encapsulated in it. You know, somewhat ironically, given we're talking about medical missionaries, it's not that clinical. There's so much of it is following people's lives through 20 years is both a long and a short period of time, depending on how you look at it. But even so, and what I want to ask now, because it's a little more open-ended, is of the main cases you research for the book, and I sort of said 5 in that you divided it into 5 periods, but you're mostly following people through 5 periods. But of the cases you looked at, what did you find the most interesting to work on, and why?
That's a hard one. I would have to say that in terms of topical cases or frameworks, it was the role of missionary images and image making in wartime China that I alluded to earlier, the Second Sino-Japanese War, that was perhaps the most intriguing, because I was able to follow missionaries who deployed their visual devices and prior skills in photography and filmmaking to respond to their particular places in the war. And whether that was documenting military atrocities during the Nanjing Massacre on film, producing propaganda film strips for the nationalist government in West China, or creating visual messages in a bottle, like the one I just talked about, under Japanese occupation in North China. These are all happening under very difficult conditions.
So focusing on that, what do all of these cases say about American missionaries in China at this time?
Sure, for this particular chapter in wartime, which is chapter 4 of the book, it really says a lot about what happens to image making and missionary projects during times of chaos and national fragmentation. For example, the films of the Nanjing Massacre, shot by the Reverend John McGee, escape the missionary enterprise completely and become documentary artifacts that circulate around the world, raising awareness about atrocities and international responses, or lack of responses, to it. In other cases, images reflect the contingencies of the war and how it affects individual missionary experience. So again, the same family I mentioned earlier, the Scovilles, a Presbyterian medical missionary family in the city of Jining in Shandong province, they send out their color film, but they also hide reels of family movies and mission footage between the walls of their house to keep these precious objects safe from Japanese surveillance until they're moved into an internment camp for foreign nationals in 1942. The family, not the movies. The absolutely amazing thing about these films is that during the times in internment that the family spent, the reels end up falling into the basement of the house, still between the walls, and they're not recovered until the first decade of the 2000s, when workmen are tearing down the structure to make way for an expansion of the hospital nearby, the same hospital that these missionaries had worked at. And then when two of the Scoville family sons went back to visit China in the spring of 2016, they were treated to a surprise screening of their pre-war films, which had been discovered and digitized by the Jining Museum. So I would say that these materials and visual practices tell us not only about the fragmentation of China in wartime, but also represent how image making and images can bridge time and space, sometimes in very unexpected ways.
If we want to go back into kind of the theoretical side of photography here and the bridging of time and space, you talk quite a lot about that weird temporality of images. They always depict something that has been. Could you go into a little more depth on what that might mean, I guess, in a way that is quite comprehensible to a layman in an audio format?
Sure, I'll give it a shot.
Yeah.
So I would say that, and this is I'm drawing from the semiotician Roland Barthes, who writes about images as representing some kind of reality that was there before the lens. Now, that reality can be manipulated and transformed, evolved in the process of this image being produced and then circulated and imagined, but something was there. And what we make of that something then says something else about the reality and experiences of these images and devices within the histories that we're looking at. And I'm sure that applies to all sorts of histories in which cameras make an appearance.
This sort of randomly put me in mind of an incident you described where one particular missionary, I think it was one of the Passionists, had got a timer set up on his camera so that he could sort of run into group photos after pressing the trigger, but on one occasion sort of didn't quite make it in time, and there's this blur in the background. And a thought I had is then, what's the role of the camera operator in all this, especially when they're not visible?
Excellent question. So I would say that the role of the camera operator, of course, is being embedded in that environment. That, again, going back to the question of writing, one could write about an environment and never actually be there, or perhaps be there for a short time. But when missionaries are living there for years and years, their cameras are with them for years and years. So essentially, they're engaging in, I would call it an odyssey of a device, an odyssey of people, in which the camera operator has to be there in some way and then transmits or engages with these images and the environment in very specific ways. And in some cases, like you mentioned, contingency, where they mess up a photo or they misdevelop it or they run to the picture at the wrong time, things that we all can perhaps imagine in our own experience. But that involves presence, and that's what I believe the camera operator does.
In a way, photography seems like it tells us so much, and yet it is still a limited slice, isn't it? You have to choose to take the photograph. You have to make sure that it does actually look as good as you thought it did when you took it, and it has to survive. How much of a limitation is this? Does opening up the realm of photographs carry the risk of accidentally saying it opens up too much?
Excellent question. In terms of opening up too much, it certainly complicates historical narratives. But it also, photography and images also have silences. We can't see beyond the edges of the frame. We don't know what photographers chose not to make images of, or what they changed in a scene before the shutter snapped or the film started rolling. So they have this presence in history that, again, we don't necessarily see all of. And yet, what we can see, or perhaps recover, are the traces of that presence and of what these images do and where they go. So I would say it doesn't necessarily mean we shouldn't look deeply into images, or perhaps the complexities are too challenging to work with, but rather to see them as integral to the fabric of history and that they speak to other forms of historical documentation.
This put me in mind a bit of I forget which specific chapter it was in, but of a group of missionaries who were undergoing language training in Beijing right as the Northern Expedition is happening. And they sort of go to bed under a nominal Beiyang Republic and wake up, in the Nationalist Republic of China. But yeah, there isn't a photo that captures the moment of transition. Interesting, is that? That's a kind of a process that doesn't. Well, even if they were awake for, what photo can you take that says this is the change of government? And I was thinking, in a way, that's a thing that can only be expressed through text, where you can very quickly contrast that kind of thing in one or two sentences. So, in a sense, what makes photographs so special is that that they capture a very specific moment in such specific detail. So to drill in very specifically, what would you say was your favorite specific photograph?
Well, that's again a challenging question. Having looked at thousands and thousands of these images, one that comes to mind, in fact, is an image of this missionary family sitting on the steps of their mission residence in the year about 1936. And two things about the photograph stand out to me. One of which is that there is a box sitting on a ledge behind this family. And once you see the box, you cannot unsee the box, because it turns out that this box is actually in this still photograph. This box is a 16 millimeter movie camera that has been sent by an American church to this family to document their experiences in motion pictures. And the second thing about this image that stands out to me is that it represents the personal connections that I have to some of this material, in that this is a missionary couple, father and mother, and two boys. And the younger boy, who's sitting on his mother's lap, is one of my research contacts, in that I met him many, many years later, and he was the one who started me on this journey. So to see him as a small child in China in the mid-1930s, also next to a movie camera that then becomes very important for other parts of my research, ties together the kinds of technological and personal experiences that are involved. And that's one of the images that stands out to me.
I don't think I have anything particularly profound to add to that. But to redirect a bit, one thing I'm surprised we didn't go over, but probably I should have asked about, is actually what is the technology of photography and filmmaking like over this period? Because it does evolve a little bit as well. But I guess one of the critical things is, what have we been talking about all this time with regard to medium?
Sure. So for me, I look at this period and realize that missionary imaging in China maps onto a larger global history of amateur photography and filmmaking, of documentary photography and filmmaking, driven by compact cameras. And some of these images, some of these devices may be familiar to some listeners, like the Leica or the Rolleiflex, these kinds of, at the time, they were called miniature cameras, but cameras that shoot more photographs on roll film and are able to be manipulated more smoothly and quickly compared to larger, bulkier studio or large format cameras. So the compact device, the proliferation of the ability to make more and better images quickly and in a mobile fashion really revolutionizes the ways that images can be produced by missionaries embedded in these very challenging environments in China. And certainly the introduction of amateur movie cameras shapes the narrative even further in producing films with different kinds of narrative content. And finally, color shows up with color slides and color film. And that too adds another level of reality or different kind of way of seeing this experience through yet another lens.
Oh, with regard to that colour film, it seems like such a complicated process as well, because you mentioned it seems like huge amounts of film being made. Just from a purely technical standpoint, how is that being produced?
And that's part of the technical revolution of this period, that Kodachrome film as a self-contained medium that does not require the photographer to develop different kinds of film emulsions or using different filters. That comes into play in the mid-1930s and into the late 1930s. And of course, as we all know from just the experience of seeing slideshows of the 40s and 50s and 60s explodes across the world in that later time period. So that itself, the 35 millimeter color emulsion, Kodachrome and later different kinds of color emulsions in smaller film formats, allows for this capturing of images that are in full color without added types of technological input.
What's kind of almost intriguing as well is that The Wizard of Oz did not come out that long before at least a couple of missionaries had access to these kinds of small color cameras as well. It speaks to the kind of the speed at which technology was propagating, it seems.
That's right.
To kind of paradoxically go back to the past a bit, because my specialism is kind of the mid-19th century. I look at the Taiping for the most part. And so I'm used to a period in which missionaries are kind of part of a broader and consciously imperialistic effort to bring about particular desired social change in China. What's really quite striking is, because I hadn't been really familiar with the historiography and the history of 20th century missionary activity, that's not so much the case by the time you get to the 20th century, that it all seems much more cooperative and about building up indigenous religious networks for their own sake. And what I want to ask then is, what role did photography have in this effort, and in turn also what does photography say about this effort, and how does it portray, in a sense, this different approach to what being a missionary in China meant?
Sure. So I call it missionary modernity. Now, China, of course, is going through its own modern development in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, and beyond. But the missionaries in this period are considering themselves citizens of, in some cases, citizens of this transnational global project, that they are no longer bound to just one country, that they are moving between China and the United States. And in being a modern missionary, you think about ways of modern mediation. And the camera, new technologies, of course, play into this by being able to transmit knowledge in modern forms, but also to mediate and also to bridge communities across the Pacific. And if one is to consider oneself a modern missionary, you not only document things in a contemporary way, but you consider how images don't just stay in one place, but that they are meant to connect communities and connect projects and represent collaboration. So all of those things, I believe, are part of this experience.
That connectivity is something that comes through so strongly. It's what I hadn't really thought about was these sort of year-long furloughs back in the United States. It's not that I hadn't thought that missionaries would go back to the United States at all, but in a sense, I'd had the impression that, well, they turn up for a while and then go back forever. But no, there are these sustained networks that try to keep themselves going, even though ultimately by the turn of the 1950s that will be sort of swept away. And it's it goes to show that the world has never been that big of a place in a way. It's always been a small world, albeit smaller over time.
Oh, I can add one thing to that, if you don't mind. So on the question of connectivity, and you mentioning this kind of connection across the world, we often think of missionaries producing images in China and then bringing them back to the United States. But in the case of the furloughs, we have missionaries producing images in the United States and bringing them back to China. And these are movie films that this particular family, which I mentioned earlier, shoots in the Midwest, in Illinois. And when they make these images, they explicitly exclude images of big cities and huge technology. They're actually interested in connecting forms of rural modernity in the United States to rural reform in China. So they're trying to find images that would resonate with Chinese audiences by making them back in the United States. So there's a back and forth. It's not just one direction.
On that note, I guess that seems like a pretty good place to conclude. So thank you so much for coming on. And well, I hope that this leads a lot of people to read your book, because I certainly read it for this podcast, and I thought it's a very enlightening book on a fascinating topic that I think a lot of us just hadn't considered.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.